The history books call it a Cold War, and that word, cold, has done more to obscure reality than almost any other single word in the entire 20th century vocabulary. Cold implies distance. It implies restraint. It implies a kind of managed friction between two superpowers who understood that pulling the trigger would end civilization as both of them knew it, and so they chose not to. That version of events is not exactly wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. What the word cold erases is everything that happened in the space between intention and accident. It erases the systems that were designed, built, buried, and activated without any human hand touching them. It erases the near launches, the miscalculated signals, the radar ghosts that looked exactly like incoming warheads, the submarines that lost contact with command and were left, for hours at a time, to interpret silence as either peace or war. It erases the bureaucratic architecture that was constructed over 40 years to manage the end of the world as a procedural event rather than a human one. And most significantly, it erases the emergency systems, the hidden infrastructure scattered across the American continent, inside mountains, beneath city streets, along the floors of rivers, inside fortified government buildings that were never shown on any publicly available map. Systems that were not designed to prevent nuclear war, but to survive it, administer it, and in some configurations, automatically respond to it without waiting for a living person to give the order. This is not a story about diplomacy. It is not a story about Kennedy and Khrushchev staring each other down across a table in October of 1962. It is a story about what happens when a government decides that human judgment is too slow, too unreliable, and too vulnerable to be trusted with the most consequential decisions in human history. It is a story about systems designed to function in the absence of the people who built them. And it is a story that has never fully ended, because those systems were not dismantled when the Soviet Union collapsed. They were reclassified, updated, quietly carried forward into a new century that inherited all of the infrastructure of the old fear without inheriting any of the context that made it feel rational. The first thing to understand is that the American government's relationship with continuity of operations, the bureaucratic phrase for keeping the government alive after a nuclear strike, began not in the early Cold War, but during the Second World War, when federal planners first confronted the reality that a modern industrial nation could be decapitated, could have its command structure destroyed faster than any successor could be named. By 1945, with the memory of Pearl Harbor still fresh and the new reality of atomic weapons already reshaping every strategic calculation, the question of what happens to the government if Washington disappears had become an urgent institutional priority. The answer developed over the following 4 decades in a process that involved hundreds of contractors, classified executive orders, sealed congressional appropriations, and the labor of thousands of workers who signed non-disclosure agreements before they understood what they were building was a network of hardened facilities distributed across the continental United States and beyond, connected by dedicated communications lines, stocked with supplies, staffed by rotating teams of personnel, and designed to receive the surviving remnants of the federal government in the hours after a nuclear exchange. What makes these facilities historically significant is not simply that they existed. Governments have always had contingency plans. What makes them significant is the scale of the secrecy maintained around them, the degree to which they were integrated into the actual decision-making architecture of the nuclear deterrent system, and the extent to which their existence and their operational logic shaped American domestic policy in ways that the public was never told about. These were not backup offices. They were parallel governments, equipped with the legal authority, the communications infrastructure, and in some cases the weapons release authorization to continue functioning as the United States of America, even if every city in the country had been reduced to ash. The most famous of these facilities, and the one that has been most thoroughly documented in the decades since its partial declassification, is the installation built inside Raven Rock Mountain in Pennsylvania, formerly designated Site R, officially known as the Alternate Joint Communications Center, and colloquially referred to within certain military circles as the Underground Pentagon. Construction began in 1950, during the opening years of the Korean War, when the strategic calculus of the early Cold War was still being written in real time. The site was chosen for its geology: granite, solid and deep, capable of absorbing blast overpressure from nuclear detonations that would liquefy ordinary soil and collapse conventional structures. Workers blasted 5 parallel tunnels into the mountain, each one large enough to drive a truck through, and then connected those tunnels with cross passages to create a subterranean campus that would eventually encompass more than 100,000 square feet of operational space. Inside Raven Rock, the government built everything a functioning command authority would need: office space, communications rooms, a power plant capable of operating independently of the national grid, water reservoirs, fuel storage, cafeterias, dormitories, a medical facility, and the communications backbone that would allow whoever was sheltering inside to reach the president, the national command authority, the nuclear release codes, and the field commanders responsible for executing a retaliatory strike. The facility was staffed around the clock, every day of the year, with rotating shifts of military and civilian personnel whose job was to be ready at any moment to receive the senior leadership of the United States government and to support their function as a wartime command authority. This was not a theoretical exercise. People lived this reality for decades. They drove to a mountain in Pennsylvania, badged through security, descended into the granite, and spent their shifts monitoring communications, maintaining equipment, and rehearsing procedures for a war that was always possible and never quite arrived. What was not publicly known for most of Raven Rock's operational history was the precise nature of the communication systems installed inside it, particularly the systems designed to maintain contact with the nuclear arsenal even after Washington had been destroyed. The communications redundancy built into that facility was not simply a matter of having backup radio equipment. It involved dedicated landlines buried at depths designed to survive near-miss detonations, satellite uplinks with hardened ground terminals, extremely low-frequency transmitters capable of reaching submarines deep beneath the ocean surface, and protocols for authenticating nuclear release orders that could be executed by whoever happened to be sheltering inside the mountain. Whether that person was the President, the Secretary of Defense, or a designated successor several levels removed from the constitutional line, the system was designed to ensure that the nuclear deterrent remained credible even in the worst possible scenario, which meant ensuring that someone, somewhere, always had the technical capability to launch a retaliatory strike. Whether that someone had the wisdom to make the right decision in those circumstances was a question the system did not ask. Approximately 60 miles to the south, beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, another facility was constructed in the late 1950s that represented a different, and in some ways even more troubling aspect of the American continuity of government architecture. The Greenbrier Bunker, built beneath the luxury resort of the same name in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, was not a military facility. It was a congressional facility designed to shelter the legislative branch of the United States government in the event of a nuclear attack. The Greenbrier Resort was selected in part because its renovation in the late 1950s provided cover for the construction project, which required excavating an enormous underground annex connected to the main building by a tunnel disguised as a maintenance corridor. The bunker itself contained separate chambers for the House of Representatives and the Senate, a broadcast studio from which surviving legislators could address the nation, communications equipment, power generation, food and water storage, and dormitory space for over 1,000 people. It operated under a maintenance contract with a communications company that served as cover for the rotating staff of government personnel who kept the facility in a constant state of readiness. The Greenbrier Bunker operated in total secrecy for more than 30 years. Resort staff knew something was located in the restricted section of the property, but were not told what it was. Guests at one of the most famous luxury hotels in America slept above a facility designed to house the United States Congress during the end of civilization. The facility was finally disclosed in a 1992 Washington Post article, after which the government acknowledged its existence, terminated the maintenance contract, and began a process of selective declassification. But the disclosure itself raised questions that were never fully answered. If Congress survived in the Greenbrier bunker while Washington was destroyed, who would they represent? The cities that had elected them would be gone. The states that had sent them to the Capitol would be unrecognizable. The constitutional framework within which their authority existed would have no physical reality to correspond to. They would be legislators without a country, voting on bills in a mountain while the surface above them was uninhabitable. The system was designed to preserve the form of government without ever seriously confronting the question of whether that form would retain any meaning in the aftermath of what it was designed to survive. A third category of facility, less well documented and in many cases still partially classified, was the network of Federal Emergency Management Agency relocation centers distributed across the country at distances calculated to place them outside the expected blast radius of strikes on major metropolitan areas. These facilities, sometimes described in internal documents as Federal Preparedness Agency regional centers and at other times simply as continuity sites, were established in ordinary-seeming office buildings, warehouse complexes, and government-owned properties in mid-sized cities and rural areas that had been evaluated as low-priority nuclear targets. Their function was to provide a framework for regional governance after a nuclear exchange, a way of reconstituting some form of administrative authority below the level of the national command structure in the areas that survived. The people designated to staff these facilities were a mix of federal career employees, military reservists, and state-level officials who had received classified briefings on their continuity assignments without always being given a complete picture of what the national architecture looked like or how many of their designated colleagues would realistically be alive to report. The communications system that linked these facilities together was one of the most extensive and expensive infrastructure projects of the Cold War, though it was never described in those terms in any public budget document. The backbone of this system was the Federal Telecommunications System, a dedicated government network that ran parallel to the commercial telephone infrastructure and was designed to remain functional after a nuclear strike disrupted the civilian grid. This network included hardened switching centers buried at depths calculated to resist blast effects, redundant routing paths that could automatically reconfigure around destroyed nodes, satellite connections maintained through hardened ground stations, and priority protocols that would commandeer surviving commercial circuits in the event of national emergency. The system was supplemented by a network of emergency broadcast facilities, including designated stations in the emergency broadcast system that were equipped with backup power and hardened transmitters, specifically so they could continue operating in post-attack conditions and serve as the voice of whatever governmental authority had survived. The emergency broadcast system itself, the network that American television and radio audiences encountered periodically throughout the Cold War, in the form of test signals and the familiar announcement that this is a test of the emergency broadcast system, this is only a test, was never quite what it appeared to be in its public presentation. Its public face was a civil defense tool, a way of communicating warnings to the population in the event of attack. But its operational architecture was designed around a more complex function. Specifically, the function of authenticating and relaying orders from the surviving command authority to the population and to subordinate officials. The stations designated as primary entry points for emergency messages were not simply local affiliates with backup generators. They were facilities integrated into the classified communications architecture, equipped with authentication protocols for verifying that messages were genuinely from the designated command authority rather than from Soviet deception operations attempting to issue false orders, and staffed by personnel who had received instructions about what to broadcast in scenarios that the public was never told existed. One of the most significant and least discussed elements of the American Cold War emergency infrastructure was the system of airborne command posts, aircraft that carried senior military and civilian officials and the communications equipment necessary to maintain command authority even after ground-based facilities had been destroyed. The most well-known of these was the National Airborne Operations Center, a fleet of modified Boeing aircraft, designated E-4B, kept on continuous alert, with crews trained to take off within minutes of a warning and remain airborne for extended periods, refueling in flight if necessary, while serving as a mobile nuclear command post. These aircraft were designed to operate in the electromagnetic pulse environment that would follow nuclear detonations. Their electronics hardened against the pulse that would disable most unprotected equipment. They could communicate with submarines through trailing wire antennas, reach land-based missile forces through satellite links, and maintain contact with the National Command Authority wherever that authority happened to be located at the moment of attack. The existence of these aircraft was not secret in the same way that Raven Rock or the Greenbrier Bunker were secret. They were acknowledged, at least in general terms, as part of the deterrence posture. But the specific capabilities of the communications systems they carried, the precise nature of the release authorities they were empowered to exercise, and the protocols for what would happen if they lost contact with the president and could not re-establish it before a decision window closed, those elements remained classified for decades and remain only partially understood today. What is known is that the system was designed with a recognition that the president might not be reachable, might not be alive, and that in that scenario, the military chain of command needed clear procedures for who could authorize what. The procedures that were developed were not, in their essential logic, procedures that required the survival of elected civilian authority. They were procedures that required the survival of someone within a designated chain, military or civilian, who had the authentication codes and the authority to use them. This tension between civilian control of the military and the operational requirements of nuclear command and control was one of the defining unresolved problems of the entire Cold War period. Every administration from Truman onward struggled with it in some form. The constitutional requirement that the president serve as commander-in-chief implied that only the president could authorize the use of nuclear weapons. But the operational reality of nuclear war, specifically the reality that a surprise attack might kill the president before any order could be given, created enormous pressure to pre-delegate authority, to distribute release authorization to military commanders who would still be alive, even if Washington was gone. The systems built to resolve this tension were built in secret, revised in secret, and never submitted to public democratic deliberation, because the government determined, correctly or not, that the deliberation itself would undermine the credibility of the deterrent by revealing its limitations. The Jason Strategic Target List, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, and the succession of classified nuclear posture documents that shaped American strategy from the 1950s through the end of the Cold War all reflected this fundamental problem. They were documents that described, in extraordinary detail, what the United States would do if the worst happened, but they were documents that no elected official outside a small circle had ever read, that no congressional committee had ever subjected to adversarial scrutiny, and that reflected the institutional preferences of military planners more than the considered judgment of democratic governance. The emergency systems built to execute those plans were similarly insulated from public accountability. They were the hardware of a decision-making process that had been deliberately removed from the ordinary channels of political life. Beneath the streets of Washington itself, a network of tunnels and hardened facilities provided the most immediate layer of the capital's emergency infrastructure. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, located beneath the east wing of the White House, was the facility from which the president would direct the initial response to an attack if evacuation to a more distant location were not possible. Its existence was acknowledged after the September 2001 attacks, when Vice President Cheney was publicly reported to have been taken there on the morning of the attacks. But its capabilities, its communications infrastructure, Its connection to the broader continuity of government architecture remained classified. What was visible to the public was a small portion of a much larger system, one that included dedicated communication lines running beneath the streets of the capital, hardened relay stations, connections to the military communications backbone, and protocols for what the president would do and who would speak on behalf of the government in the first minutes and hours after an attack began. The tunnel systems beneath Washington were supplemented by a network of surface transportation assets maintained in constant readiness, specifically for the evacuation of senior government officials. These included dedicated helicopter routes from the White House and the Pentagon to evacuation facilities in Virginia and Maryland, vehicles with secure communications maintained by military units whose sole function was executive transport in emergency conditions, and protocols for prioritizing the movement of specific officials in a sequence determined by their position in the nuclear command authority rather than their constitutional rank. These protocols meant, in practice, that certain senior military officials whose function was the physical execution of nuclear war plans would be evacuated ahead of officials who outranked them in the peacetime hierarchy, because the operational logic of deterrence placed a higher value on preserving the capability to launch than on preserving the capability to legislate. Outside the Washington metropolitan area, a series of facilities in the surrounding states served as intermediate relocation points, places where officials could be brought in the first hours of an emergency before being moved to more distant hardened sites if the situation warranted. These facilities included military installations, National Guard armories, and designated federal buildings that had been quietly retrofitted with emergency communications equipment, backup power, and secure conference rooms without any public announcement of their dual function. Workers at these facilities often knew that certain areas were restricted and that certain equipment was maintained to standards far beyond what ordinary office use would require. But they were not told, and often did not ask, what specific scenario the unusual preparations were designed to address. One of the most technically sophisticated components of the American Cold War emergency infrastructure was the network of early warning systems designed to provide enough advance notice of a Soviet attack to allow some portion of the command structure to survive and respond. The ballistic missile early warning system, a chain of enormous radar installations located in Alaska, Greenland, and the United Kingdom, was designed to detect the characteristic radar signature of ballistic missiles launched from Soviet territory and to provide warning to the National Command Authority within minutes of detection. The system was connected directly to the communications backbone that linked the command authority to the nuclear forces, so that a warning from the radar network would immediately trigger a cascade of alerts through the emergency communications infrastructure, activating the airborne command posts, alerting submarine crews, and initiating the procedures for bringing the senior leadership to their emergency relocation facilities. The critical weakness of this system, a weakness that was understood by its designers and that produced some of the most alarming near misses of the entire Cold War, was that it could not distinguish with perfect reliability between a genuine ballistic missile attack and a variety of other phenomena that produced similar radar signatures. The radar systems were calibrated to detect the specific trajectory and velocity profile of intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they had no way to know, in real time, whether what they were detecting was a weapon or something else. And in the early years of the system's operation, before extensive operational experience had accumulated and before software filtering had improved, the threshold for a warning that would activate the emergency architecture was low enough that false alerts were not just possible, but predictable. In October of 1960, the ballistic missile early warning system radar at Thule Air Force Base in Greenland reported a massive incoming Soviet missile attack. The radar was showing returns that corresponded to a large-scale strike, the kind of attack that the system had been designed to detect. The warning was transmitted through the emergency communications network. Officials were alerted. The procedures for executive evacuation were initiated. And then, within minutes, the warning was identified as a false alarm. The radar had detected the rising moon. The electromagnetic reflection from the lunar surface at a particular angle of elevation during a particular phase of the moon's orbit had produced radar returns that the system interpreted as incoming missiles. The moon had nearly started a nuclear war. This incident was classified and not publicly known for many years, but it was not unique. Over the course of the Cold War, the American early warning system generated multiple false alerts, significant enough to activate emergency procedures. In November of 1979, a training tape containing a simulated Soviet attack scenario was accidentally loaded into the operational computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters in Colorado, causing the system to report a massive incoming attack and activating emergency procedures before the error was identified. In June of 1980, a faulty integrated circuit in the early warning computers caused the system to report intermittently that between 2 and 220 missiles had been launched, generating alerts that reached senior military commanders before the malfunction was diagnosed. In both cases, the procedures were deactivated before any irreversible action was taken. But the margin between a managed false alarm and an unmanaged escalation was, in both cases, measured in minutes. The Soviet side of this equation was equally fraught, and the American emergency systems were designed against a threat that was itself organized around the same fundamental uncertainties, the same reliance on automated systems, and the same institutional culture of managing the possibility of catastrophe through procedure rather than judgment. In September of 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite reported that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The duty officer at the Soviet Early Warning Command Center, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, was responsible for evaluating the warning and forwarding it to superiors, who would then make the decision whether to recommend a retaliatory launch. Petrov looked at the data, considered the fact that the satellite system had previously shown errors, considered that a genuine American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles rather than 5, and reported the alert as a probable malfunction. He was correct. The satellite had been confused by an unusual alignment of sunlight and high-altitude cloud cover over missile fields in the American Midwest. But his decision to report it as a malfunction rather than a genuine attack was not a conclusion that the system he was operating could reach on its own. It required a human being who was willing to trust his own judgment over the readout on his screen. The American emergency systems were designed, at least in theory, to include such human checkpoints, moments where a person was required to evaluate information before an irreversible action was taken. But the design of those checkpoints was shaped by the operational pressure to respond quickly enough that a genuine attack could not succeed in destroying the response capability, and this pressure systematically shortened the time available for evaluation. The window between a warning and the point at which missiles could be launched in response was defined by physics and geography, by the flight time of Soviet missiles from their silos to American targets. And that window was narrow. Sufficiently narrow that the systems were designed to begin preparing a response almost immediately upon warning, so that the response would be ready if the attack proved genuine. The preparing of a response was not the same as executing it, but the preparation itself created institutional momentum, activated personnel, consumed attention, and made the eventual decision to stand down feel like a reversal of a process already underway, rather than simply a decision not to act. This asymmetry between the institutional ease of continuing down the path of escalation and the institutional difficulty of stopping was one of the most dangerous features of the entire Cold War emergency architecture. The systems were designed to make the response automatic up to a point, with a human decision required only at the last moment before irreversible action. But the last moment was defined by the system, not by the decision-maker, and the decision-maker was making a choice under conditions of extreme time pressure, incomplete information, and institutional pressure to take the threat seriously rather than dismiss it. The Petrov incident illustrated how much depended on the individual judgment of people who happened to be in the right position at the right moment, and how little the systems themselves were designed to create the conditions for good judgment. The hardened command center beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, formerly designated as the North American Aerospace Defense Command Combat Operations Center, represented the most visible and in some ways most symbolically significant element of the American Cold War emergency infrastructure. The facility was constructed inside the mountain beginning in 1961, with workers removing more than 600,000 tons of granite to create the excavated chambers that would house the electronics, the personnel, and the mechanical systems necessary to maintain continuous aerospace surveillance over the North American continent. The buildings inside the mountain were constructed on enormous springs designed to absorb the shock of nearby nuclear detonations so that the facility could continue functioning even as the mountain above it absorbed blast effects that would destroy anything on the surface. The facility was connected to the outside world by a single access tunnel, guarded, reinforced, and designed to be sealed from the inside. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, teams of analysts and controllers sat before banks of displays that received data from radar networks, satellite systems, infrared sensors, and acoustic monitoring installations scattered across the globe, all of it integrated into a picture of global aerospace activity that was updated continuously and evaluated against threat libraries designed to identify any activity that might represent an attack in progress. The facility operated around the clock, 7 days a week, through every decade of the Cold War, with the singular purpose of ensuring that an attack would be detected in time for the National Command Authority to respond. It was, in a very literal sense, a place designed to watch for the end of the world, staffed by people whose professional identity was built around the possibility that the thing they were watching for might actually happen. The psychological dimension of this work, the experience of living professionally inside the anticipation of catastrophe for an entire career, was never discussed in the public presentation of facilities like Cheyenne Mountain. The official narrative was one of professionalism, capability, and deterrence. But the human reality of working inside a system designed to manage the end of the world as a procedural event produced distinctive institutional cultures that were never examined by the people who built the systems or authorized the budgets that sustained them. Personnel rotated through the facilities on schedules designed to maintain operational readiness. They received training that normalized the scenario they were preparing for. They developed professional relationships with colleagues who shared the same classified knowledge and the same institutional mission, creating communities of people who understood things that most of the population did not know and could not be told. The classification system that protected these facilities and the knowledge associated with them was itself one of the most significant institutional legacies of the Cold War. The culture of secrecy that developed around the nuclear command and control infrastructure was not simply a security practice. It was an epistemological framework, a way of organizing knowledge into categories of who was allowed to know what and why, and under what conditions they could share it. This framework shaped not just the specific facts about emergency facilities, but the broader relationship between the government and the population it ostensibly served. It established that certain knowledge, specifically the knowledge most directly relevant to whether citizens would live or die, was categorically unavailable to the people most directly affected by it. The justification for this secrecy was always operational. Revealing the locations and capabilities of emergency facilities would allow a potential adversary to target them more effectively. Revealing the specific protocols for nuclear release authority would allow adversaries to design attacks that exploited the gaps in those protocols. Revealing the details of early warning system capabilities would allow adversaries to design attack profiles that evaded detection. These were not unreasonable arguments in the context of a genuine adversarial relationship with a nuclear-armed state. But they had the effect of placing the entire architecture of survival, the infrastructure that determined whether any element of the American government would function after a nuclear attack, completely outside the domain of democratic accountability. The people who funded it, through their taxes, could not know what they were funding. The people who would be most affected by its performance, meaning everyone, could not evaluate whether it was well designed. The people who would be asked to survive in whatever world it created could not participate in deciding what that world would look like. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, was created in 1979 through the consolidation of several existing civil defense and emergency management agencies, and it became the primary public face of the American government's preparedness infrastructure. But FEMA had a classified mission that was distinct from its public function, and that classified mission was centered on continuity of government rather than continuity of the population. The agency maintained a network of facilities, communication systems, and personnel assignments designed to preserve federal authority after a catastrophic attack, and the resources devoted to this classified mission consistently exceeded those devoted to the agency's public mission of helping ordinary Americans prepare for and recover from disasters. This disparity was noticed by congressional overseers who occasionally gained access to classified briefings on FEMA's continuity programs, and it generated criticism that the agency was more concerned with preserving the government than with protecting the people. But this criticism never resulted in fundamental changes to the agency's classified priorities. The continuity facilities maintained by FEMA were distributed across the country in a pattern designed to ensure that at least some of them would survive any plausible attack scenario. The facilities were located in areas assessed as low-probability targets, typically smaller cities and rural areas far from military installations and population centers that would be high on any Soviet targeting list. They were built to varying specifications depending on their role in the continuity architecture, with the most critical command facilities hardened to survive near-miss detonations and stocked with supplies calculated to sustain their occupants for extended periods. The personnel assigned to staff these facilities were designated by name in classified documents and were expected to report to their assigned facilities upon activation of the emergency system, leaving behind whatever personal situation, family, responsibilities they had in ordinary life, on the theory that the preservation of federal authority was sufficiently important to override any other consideration. One of the most significant and least examined aspects of the entire continuity of government architecture was the legal framework that would govern whatever authority survived. The system was designed on the assumption that the constitutional framework of the United States could be preserved, at least in form, even after a nuclear exchange, and that the surviving fragment of the government would operate within that framework in conducting whatever business needed to be conducted in the aftermath. But the legal assumptions embedded in the continuity plans were never tested against the reality of what a post-nuclear America would actually look like. The plans assumed a surviving population large enough to constitute a meaningful body politic, surviving infrastructure sufficient to support some form of administration, and surviving institutional structures capable of exercising authority in recognizable ways. None of these assumptions were guaranteed by any of the scenarios that strategic planners actually considered realistic. The Presidential Succession Act, which defines the line of succession to the presidency, and the continuity plans built around it, assumed that the constitutional successors would be available to take office. But the targeting priorities embedded in Soviet war plans, to the extent that they can be reconstructed from declassified Soviet documents and from American analysis of likely Soviet strategy, suggested that the Soviets would have targeted precisely the facilities and the locations where the constitutional successors would be concentrated. Washington, the Pentagon, the facilities where senior cabinet officials worked, the military command centers from which the constitutional successors would operate, all of these were primary targets in the Soviet strategic plan. The probability that the constitutional line of succession would survive a genuine full-scale Soviet first strike was, by almost any honest assessment, low. The continuity plans assumed survivors because they had to assume survivors to have any purpose, but the strategic reality they were designed to manage did not guarantee that the assumption would be satisfied. The Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center, located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia near the town of Berryville, was perhaps the most significant of the high-priority government relocation facilities and remained classified in its essential details for longer than almost any comparable installation. The facility was operated by FEMA and served as the primary relocation site for the President and senior executive branch officials. It had been constructed beginning in the early 1950s and expanded repeatedly over the following decades, and by the time of the Cold War's end, it had grown into a substantial underground community with its own power plant, water treatment facilities, hospital, crematorium, radio and television studios, and enough supplies to sustain its occupants for an extended period. It was connected to the national communications infrastructure through multiple redundant links, including satellite connections and hardened landlines, and it maintained its own internal communications network capable of operating even if all external connections were severed. Mount Weather was activated for operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the government came closer to a genuine nuclear exchange than at any other point in the Cold War. Senior officials and their staffs were briefed on evacuation procedures. The facility was placed on heightened alert. Supplies were checked and inventoried. Personnel were placed on standby to receive evacuees. The 13 days of the crisis, during which Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged communications in an atmosphere of managed tension, while military forces on both sides moved to positions from which they could execute war plans within hours, were days during which the emergency infrastructure was not simply a contingency, but an active preparation. The government was, for those 13 days, genuinely prepared to evacuate its senior leadership to a hole in a mountain in Virginia and continue operating from there while the surface world burned. What is less well known about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how close the activation of those emergency procedures came to occurring not through the decision of the National Command Authority, but through independent action at lower levels of the command structure. American naval forces enforcing the quarantine of Cuba had located and were tracking several Soviet submarines. One of those submarines, designated by American forces as B-59, had been subjected to hours of harassment by American destroyers using practice depth charges intended to force it to surface. The submarine had lost contact with Moscow and had been submerged long enough that its batteries were nearly exhausted and carbon dioxide levels inside were rising to dangerous levels. Its commanding officer, Valentin Savitsky, in the belief that war had already begun based on the depth charges being dropped around his vessel, ordered the preparation of the submarine's nuclear torpedo for launch. Soviet submarines operating in the Atlantic during the Cuban Missile Crisis carried nuclear torpedoes with yields in the range of several kilotons. Weapons that would have destroyed any American naval vessel within a significant radius, and that would, by any reasonable assessment, have triggered an immediate American nuclear response. The authorization procedure for using those weapons was a point of genuine ambiguity. Standard Soviet doctrine required authorization from Moscow, but the submarine had no contact with Moscow. The local authority structure was confused by the crisis conditions and the physical stress of the operating environment. What prevented the launch was the intervention of a second senior officer aboard the submarine, Vasily Arkhipov, who held a command position that gave him equal authority to Savitsky in the decision to use the nuclear torpedo and who refused to authorize the launch. His refusal was not a procedural outcome. It was a personal decision made by an individual who concluded that the situation did not justify the action his commanding officer believed it required. The system had created a moment where one man's judgment was the only thing between a naval confrontation and a nuclear exchange. The American emergency systems were not designed around the assumption that individual judgment would be necessary. They were designed around the assumption that individual judgment would be eliminated, or at minimum constrained by procedure, so that the system would function consistently regardless of who happened to be in the relevant position at the relevant moment. But the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated, repeatedly and in multiple domains, that individual judgment was precisely what the system could not eliminate. The procedures broke down, the communications failed, the assumptions about adversary behavior proved incorrect, and in each instance, the gap between the system's designed behavior and the actual outcome was filled by the decision of a specific person who happened to be in the right place and who happened to make the decision that avoided catastrophe rather than causing it. The permissive action link, a technology designed to prevent the unauthorized use of nuclear weapons by requiring the entry of a code before a weapon could be armed, was introduced into the American nuclear arsenal in the early 1960s, partly in response to concerns about exactly this kind of unauthorized or accidental use. The technology represented an attempt to impose a physical constraint on the command and control problem, to ensure that even if the institutional procedures broke down and an unauthorized individual attempted to use a nuclear weapon, the weapon itself would not function without the proper codes. But the implementation of permissive action links was not uniform, and for years after their introduction, many weapons in the American arsenal lacked them or were equipped with locks set to codes so simple that they provided essentially no security. The codes on some weapons were set to a series of zeros by Strategic Air Command, on the theory that the procedural controls were sufficient and that the locks created an operational impediment that outweighed their security benefit. The admission that weapons designed to destroy cities were protected by codes equivalent to a password of 000000000 was not something that the government chose to highlight in its public communications about nuclear security. The Strategic Air Command, the organization responsible for America's land-based and airborne nuclear forces for most of the Cold War period, maintained its own emergency operations architecture centered on its headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. The underground command post at Offutt, connected to the broader continuity infrastructure and capable of receiving orders from the National Command Authority and transmitting them to bomber and missile crews, was the operational hub of the most powerful military force in human history. From that facility, or from the airborne command posts that operated as its airborne backup, the orders that would execute the single integrated operational plan, the massive coordinated attack that American strategy called for in response to a Soviet first strike, would be transmitted to bomber crews, submarine crews, and land-based missile crews simultaneously. The single integrated operational plan was the document that described, in precise operational terms, what American nuclear forces would do in the event of war. It was not a flexible document. It was a comprehensive schedule of targets, weapons, delivery systems, and timing sequences that had been calculated to destroy the Soviet Union's military capability, industrial base, command structure, and population centers in a coordinated attack designed to prevent any effective response. The plan was updated regularly to account for new intelligence about Soviet targets and new capabilities of American weapon systems. But its essential character, as a comprehensive plan for the near-total destruction of the Soviet Union, remained consistent across multiple administrations. Senior officials who received briefings on the plan, including some who had been hawks on defense spending and Soviet capabilities, were reportedly shocked by its scope and by the casualty projections it contained. The emergency systems built around the single integrated operational plan were designed not to prevent it from being executed, but to ensure that it could be executed even in the worst possible conditions. The hardened command posts, the airborne command aircraft, the hardened communications links, the submarine communications systems, all of these were designed with the PSYOP in mind, to ensure that the orders necessary to execute that plan could reach the forces responsible for carrying it out even after Washington had been destroyed. The system was, in its deepest logic, a mechanism for ensuring that a decision made in one moment, the decision to adopt the PSYOP as the war plan, could be executed irreversibly in a later moment, even if no living person with the authority to reconsider that decision remained alive. The submarine force, which carried a substantial fraction of the American nuclear deterrent in the form of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, was particularly important to this architecture because of the characteristics that made submarines ideal deterrence platforms. Submarines were difficult to locate and nearly impossible to destroy in a surprise attack, which meant that even if every land-based missile and every bomber were destroyed in a Soviet first strike, the submarine force would survive and could execute a retaliatory strike of devastating scope. But the same characteristics that made submarines survivable also made them difficult to communicate with. The ocean is largely opaque to radio waves, and reaching a submarine at operational depth and speed required specialized communication systems operating at frequencies that could penetrate seawater. The primary system for communicating with submarines was extremely low-frequency radio, LF, which used transmitters with enormous antenna systems spanning hundreds of miles and broadcasting at frequencies so low that the waves could penetrate several hundred feet of seawater. 2 ELF transmitter sites were constructed and operated during the Cold War, one in Michigan and one in Wisconsin, each one using a network of buried cables extending for dozens of miles as the antenna system. The transmitters operated continuously, broadcasting a signal that could be received by submarines anywhere in the world, at depth, without surfacing. The signal was low in bandwidth, capable of transmitting only a few characters per minute, which meant that it could not carry complex messages. What it could carry was a simple code that told a submarine crew whether to surface for further instructions or to execute their emergency action message procedures. The emergency action message system was the mechanism through which nuclear release orders were transmitted to submarine crews. A submarine crew receiving an emergency action message was required to verify its authenticity through a series of authentication procedures, compare its contents against the sealed authentication documents carried by the commanding officer, and, if the message authenticated and ordered a launch, prepare and execute the launch. The procedures were designed to ensure that an authentic order would be executed and that a false or corrupted order would be rejected. But they were also designed to ensure that the crew could not independently decide not to execute an authenticated order. The assumption embedded in the design was that if the authentication procedures had been satisfied, the order was legitimate and should be executed, regardless of any other information the crew might have about the state of the world. This design assumption raised a question that was never fully answered in any public forum, and that was apparently also not fully answered in classified deliberations, which is what a submarine crew should do if they have authenticated an emergency action message ordering them to launch, but have information suggesting that the launch is not appropriate. The information available to a submerged submarine was extremely limited, which was by design, because limiting a crew's access to information about the outside world reduced the risk that they would make independent judgments about whether to comply with orders. But it also meant that a crew receiving an authentic launch order had no way to independently verify whether the order reflected the actual situation or whether it was the product of a system malfunction, a communications error, or a scenario in which the people who issued the order had since concluded it was a mistake. The land-based missile forces faced a variant of the same problem. The crews of intercontinental ballistic missile silos, known as launch control officers, sat in hardened underground capsules in pairs, each pair responsible for a flight of 10 missiles, each missile targeted against specific points in the Soviet Union. Their operational procedures required that both members of the pair concur before inserting keys and turning them simultaneously to enable a launch, a two-person integrity requirement designed to prevent a single unstable or unauthorized individual from initiating a launch. But the two-person requirement was a constraint on unauthorized action, not on authorized action. If a properly authenticated launch order arrived through the proper channels, both members of the crew were expected to execute it, and procedures existed for what to do if one member refused. The procedures for addressing a crew member who refused a legitimate launch order were not ambiguous in their intended resolution. The emergency communication systems designed to reach those crews, particularly in the scenario where the normal command channels had been destroyed and the backup systems were being used, included what was known as the Minimum Essential Emergency Communications Network, a collection of redundant systems designed to ensure that at least one path from the National Command Authority to the forces remained open. This network included, in addition to the ELF submarine communications and the hardened landlines, a system of airborne relay aircraft capable of rebroadcasting launch orders even in a degraded electromagnetic environment, a network of ground-based relay stations, and a system of communications satellites hardened to survive the electromagnetic pulse effects of nuclear detonations. The existence of multiple overlapping paths was intended to ensure that no single point of failure could break the connection between the authority to launch and the capability to launch. But the same redundancy that was intended to ensure that legitimate orders could get through also created pathways through which errors or false signals could propagate. An authenticated message traveling through a redundant system might reach forces through a path that had been corrupted somewhere along its route, with the corruption not detectable by the receiving crew because the authentication codes had not been altered. The system was designed to trust authentication over content, on the theory that if the authentication was valid, the content was authoritative. But this design assumption was only as secure as the authentication system itself, and the authentication system depended on the security of the codes, which depended on the security of the facilities where the codes were generated, stored, and distributed, which themselves depended on the larger security infrastructure of the nuclear command and control system. The National Security Agency, the signals intelligence organization responsible for, among many other functions, the security of American military communications, maintained its own classified facilities integrated into the emergency infrastructure. Its headquarters at Fort Meade in Maryland was a high-priority government installation with its own emergency procedures and its own hardened communications links. But more significant from the perspective of the Cold War emergency architecture was the agency's role in developing and maintaining the cryptographic systems that protected nuclear command and control communications. The codes used to authenticate nuclear release orders, to verify the identity of persons in the chain of command, and to protect the contents of classified communications from interception and decryption were products of the agency's technical work, and the security of the entire nuclear command and control system depended on the integrity of that work. The classification surrounding NSA's activities was, if anything, more complete than the classification surrounding the physical emergency facilities. The very existence of the National Security Agency was not publicly acknowledged until 1975, more than 2 decades after its creation, and the specific nature of its cryptographic work in support of nuclear command and control remained classified long after the general outlines of the agency's signals intelligence mission became widely known. This layering of secrecy, with the emergency communications infrastructure itself classified, and the systems that secured those communications classified at an even higher level, created an architecture of secrets about secrets. A system where knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities was more restricted than knowledge of the system's existence. One of the most consequential and least publicly understood elements of the Cold War emergency infrastructure was the set of protocols governing what would happen in the scenario, which some analysts assessed as the most likely scenario for a genuine nuclear exchange, not of a surprise first strike, but of an accidental war triggered by miscalculation, technical failure, or unauthorized action. The planners who built the emergency systems were aware that not all paths to nuclear war ran through deliberate decision by the National Command Authority. The Petrov incident, the B-59 submarine incident, the multiple false alerts generated by American early warning systems, all of these illustrated that the most dangerous scenarios were often ones where the system was operating in ways its designers had not anticipated, and where the appropriate response was not obvious even to the most capable person in the relevant position. The protocols for managing these scenarios, to the extent that they existed, were built around the concept of measured response. The idea that the American nuclear posture should be calibrated to allow for de-escalation even after an exchange had begun. But the operational logic of the single integrated operational plan, which was designed as a comprehensive coordinated attack rather than a measured response, was inherently difficult to reconcile with the concept of de-escalation. Once the PSYOP was being executed, withdrawing specific components of it in real time was not operationally straightforward. The plan was designed to be executed as a unified whole, because the timing relationships between different components of the attack were calculated to achieve specific operational effects, and pulling individual elements out of the sequence would disrupt those relationships. The systems built to execute the PSYOP were not designed to execute a modified or partial version of it. This rigidity was one of the persistent criticisms of American nuclear strategy made by analysts with access to classified information, and it was a criticism that was never fully resolved during the Cold War period. Multiple administrations attempted to develop what were called limited nuclear options, ways of using nuclear weapons in more targeted and limited ways that would allow for negotiation and de-escalation rather than requiring an all-or-nothing response. The Nixon administration's National Security Study Memorandum 169, the Ford administration's nuclear weapons employment policy, and subsequent strategic reviews all grappled with this problem. But the operational systems, the missiles, the submarines, the command and control architecture were not easily adapted to support limited options, and the institutional culture of Strategic Air Command was resistant to planning frameworks that assumed less than full execution of the war plan. The Pershing II missiles deployed in Western Europe in the 1980s represented a particular instance of the tension between strategic flexibility and operational rigidity that characterized the entire Cold War nuclear posture. These weapons, deployed in response to Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missiles targeted at Western Europe, were capable of reaching Soviet territory from their European launch sites in approximately 6 minutes, a flight time so short that Soviet commanders would have had almost no time to confirm the nature of an attack before they needed to decide whether to respond. The Soviets' assessment of the Pershing II threat contributed to an episode in November 1983 during a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83 that some analysts have since described as one of the closest the Cold War came to unintended nuclear exchange outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Able Archer 83 was a command post exercise designed to practice NATO procedures for the transition from conventional to nuclear war. It was a realistic exercise in a way that previous exercises had not been, involving actual senior officials and practicing the specific procedures and communications formats that would be used in a genuine transition. Soviet intelligence, monitoring the exercise through the signals, intelligence capabilities they maintained against NATO communications, could not be certain whether what they were observing was an exercise or an actual preparation for a nuclear first strike. The Soviet leadership in this period, under General Secretary Yuri Andropov, who was gravely ill and who had long believed that the Reagan administration was actively planning a first strike, was in a state of heightened alert. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were placed on elevated readiness during the exercise. Nuclear-armed aircraft were placed on alert status. The Soviet early warning system was monitoring the NATO communications with unusual intensity. What prevented Able Archer 83 from escalating beyond an exercise and beyond the alarmed Soviet response to the exercise was a combination of factors that included the exercise's eventual conclusion on schedule, the resumption of normal communications patterns that Soviet intelligence could interpret as inconsistent with an actual attack preparation, and the continued absence of the actual physical indicators that would accompany a genuine transition to nuclear operations. But the episode illustrated how the emergency systems on both sides, the communications protocols, the alert procedures, the early warning assessments, could interact in ways that amplified rather than dampened the risk of miscalculation. The Soviet response to Able Archer was, in its own terms, entirely rational, given what their intelligence was showing them. The American exercise was, in its own terms, entirely normal, given the strategic planning requirements it was designed to address. The near miss was not the product of irrational behavior by either side. It was the product of two rational institutional systems operating simultaneously in an environment that neither fully understood. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought the formal Cold War to an end, and with it came a period of disclosures about the emergency infrastructure that had been built over 40 years. Some of the most significant revelations came not from American declassification, but from Soviet and Russian sources, as former Soviet officials and military officers described elements of the Soviet nuclear command and control system that had been unknown in the West. Among the most significant of these revelations was the disclosure of a Soviet system known in Russian as perimeter, and in Western analysis as dead hand, a system designed to ensure that the Soviet nuclear arsenal could be launched, even if the entire Soviet leadership had been killed in an American first strike. The perimeter system worked through a network of command missiles, rockets that carried not warheads but communications transmitters, designed to fly over Soviet missile fields and broadcast authenticated launch orders to the missiles in those fields, triggering automatic launch without any human intervention. The command missiles could be launched by a small group of officers in a hardened bunker who had survived the initial attack, or in some configurations could be triggered automatically by sensors that detected the signatures of nuclear detonations on Soviet territory. The system was not fully automatic in the sense that it required some human action at some point, but it was designed to reduce the human role to the minimum necessary to initiate an automated process that would then proceed without further human involvement. The existence of perimeter was not publicly disclosed until the 1990s, and its precise capabilities and current status remained unclear even after partial disclosure. What the disclosure clarified was that the Soviet approach to the command and control problem had, at least in part, moved in the direction of removing human judgment from the loop rather than attempting to preserve it under extreme conditions. This was the logical endpoint of the institutional pressure to ensure that a retaliatory capability survived, regardless of what happened to the decision-makers, pushed to its limit. The dead hand system was, in its essential design, the acknowledgement that human judgment could not be trusted to survive under the conditions that nuclear war would create, and that the deterrent therefore required a mechanism that could function without it. The American response to learning of perimeter's existence was complex and not fully public. Analysts recognized that the system was, in one sense, a stabilizing factor, because it guaranteed a Soviet retaliatory capability even in the event of a decapitating American first strike, which meant that American planners could not rationally contemplate a first strike that might otherwise seem to offer the possibility of eliminating Soviet retaliation. But the system was also destabilizing in the sense that it demonstrated the degree to which the Soviet nuclear posture relied on automated decision-making rather than human judgment, which raised questions about the reliability of a system that no human being fully controlled and that was designed to function under conditions where human oversight was impossible. The American nuclear command and control architecture had its own elements that moved in the direction of reduced human control, though not to the same degree as perimeter. The procedures for what would happen if the president were unreachable were not simply a matter of activating constitutional succession. They involved pre-delegated authorities, specific conditions under which designated commanders could take actions that normally required presidential approval, and a presumption that under certain conditions, the absence of orders to stand down was itself a form of authorization to proceed. These pre-delegated authorities were classified, and their precise scope was not publicly known, but their existence was confirmed in general terms by officials who had been involved in nuclear command and control policy. The physical facilities that supported this architecture, the underground command posts, the airborne command aircraft, the hardened communications relay stations, did not disappear when the Berlin Wall fell or when the Soviet Union dissolved. They continued to be maintained, operated, and staffed. The classified appropriations that funded them continued to appear in defense budgets, buried in line items described in sufficiently vague terms that their specific purpose was not apparent. The personnel who worked in them continued to rotate through their assignments, maintaining their readiness, practicing their procedures, and sustaining the operational knowledge necessary to make the systems function. The Cold War ended, but the systems that had been built to manage it continued to exist in a kind of institutional afterlife, sustained by inertia, by classified necessity, and by the difficulty of dismantling infrastructure that had been built with the explicit understanding that it might someday be needed. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in 1983 and colloquially known as Star Wars, represented an attempt to change the fundamental logic of the nuclear deterrence system by making it possible to intercept and destroy ballistic missiles in flight, thereby potentially eliminating the offensive threat that justified the entire emergency infrastructure. The program was enormously expensive, technically ambitious, and deeply controversial, both in terms of its feasibility and in terms of its strategic implications. Soviet analysts and many Western ones argued that a successful American ballistic missile defense would undermine the stability of deterrence by potentially allowing the United States to launch a first strike and then use the missile defense to intercept whatever surviving Soviet missiles attempted to retaliate. The American argument was that defense was inherently stabilizing because it reduced the lethality of offensive weapons and thereby diminished the incentive to use them first. The debate about missile defense revealed, more clearly than almost any other Cold War policy argument, the extent to which the logic of deterrence was not simply a military calculation, but a philosophical one, dependent on assumptions about rationality, intentions, and the relationship between capability and behavior that were deeply contested and could not be resolved by technical means. The emergency systems built around the deterrence logic, the underground command posts, the airborne command aircraft, the hardened communications networks, were all expressions of a particular set of assumptions about how conflict between nuclear-armed states would unfold and what conditions had to be satisfied to make those conflicts terminable short of mutual destruction. The Strategic Defense Initiative challenged those assumptions, and the challenge was never fully resolved, because the technology never achieved the capabilities its proponents claimed for it, and the strategic debate about its implications was never concluded. The arms control agreements that punctuated the Cold War, including the SALT agreements, the ABM Treaty, START, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, were all attempts to manage the nuclear competition through negotiated constraints on the numbers, types, and locations of weapons. These agreements were significant achievements of Cold War diplomacy, and they did succeed in limiting the expansion of the nuclear arsenals and, in some cases, reducing them. But they did not address the command and control infrastructure, the emergency facilities, the communication systems, or the operational plans that determined how the weapons would be used. The agreements constrained the size of the arsenals without constraining the architecture built around the assumption that the arsenals might be used. This distinction mattered because it meant that even as the number of warheads declined, the institutional, technical, and procedural apparatus for managing nuclear war remained in place and continued to evolve. The Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, initiated in the early 1990s, was the most significant effort to address the consequences of the Cold War's end for nuclear security. The program provided American funding and technical assistance to help the successor states of the Soviet Union, primarily Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, secure and eventually eliminate the nuclear weapons and materials they had inherited. It addressed a genuine and urgent threat: the possibility that nuclear weapons or materials from the collapsed Soviet arsenal would be acquired by non-state actors or unstable successor states. And it achieved significant results in securing and eliminating specific weapons. But it did not address the operational systems, the Russian equivalent of the American command and control architecture, the hardened facilities, the communications networks, the early warning systems that had been built around those weapons. Those systems continued to operate in modified form under the authority of the Russian government that succeeded the Soviet state. The early warning satellites and ground-based radars that had watched for American missile launches continued to watch. The hardened command facilities, some of them built with even more engineering effort than their American counterparts, into the deep geology of the Ural Mountains and Siberia, continued to be maintained and staffed. The submarine force, reduced in size but not eliminated, continued to carry ballistic missiles to sea on deterrent patrols. And the Russian equivalent of the perimeter system, whatever its current form and capability, presumably continued to exist in some form, because the strategic logic that produced it, the need to guarantee a retaliatory capability regardless of what happened to the decision-makers, had not changed. The weapons and their supporting infrastructure existed in a different political context after 1991, but the technical systems themselves did not disappear, and neither did the institutional knowledge required to operate them. The American systems similarly persisted. The E-4B Airborne Command Post aircraft continued to be operated and maintained. Raven Rock continued to function as an alternate military command center. Mount Weather continued to be maintained as an executive relocation facility. The underground command post at Cheyenne Mountain, while eventually transitioning to a standby status rather than continuous manning in the mid-2000s, was maintained in a state of readiness that would allow it to be reactivated. The hardened communications networks, the ELF transmitters for submarine communications, the satellite uplinks for the nuclear command and control system, all of these continued to be operated and maintained as active infrastructure, not as museum pieces or relics of a concluded conflict. The men and women who staffed these facilities in the post-Cold War period occupied a peculiar institutional position. They maintained systems designed for a threat that had changed in character but had not disappeared. They continued to practice procedures designed for a conflict that most of their contemporaries had concluded was no longer imminent. They continued to receive classified briefings on threat assessments that described a world considerably more dangerous than the one that most of the public understood themselves to be living in. And they continued to do so largely in silence, because the classification system that had protected these facilities during the Cold War remained in place, adapted to new security categories and new threat environments, but preserving the fundamental principle that the knowledge most directly relevant to national survival was not knowledge that the public was entitled to evaluate or participate in managing. The terrorist attacks of September 2001 brought continuity of government planning into brief public view, when the emergency systems designed for nuclear war were activated in response to an attack of a fundamentally different character. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center was used. Senior officials were evacuated to undisclosed locations that were, in some cases, the same locations that had been designated for nuclear war emergencies. The Airborne Command Post system was activated. The public suddenly became aware that the government had elaborate plans for preserving its function in crisis, plans that had been developed over 50 years in connection with the nuclear threat, but that were now being applied to a very different scenario. The glimpse was brief and partial, but it revealed something important about the relationship between the emergency infrastructure and the political culture that had produced it, namely that the systems had been designed for a specific threat, but had become institutionalized as permanent features of the government's operational architecture. The post-September 2001 period brought significant investment in and expansion of the continuity of government infrastructure, with new facilities constructed, existing facilities upgraded, and the legal framework for continuity of operations expanded through new executive orders and classified directives. This investment was justified in terms of the new threat environment of terrorism and cyber attack rather than nuclear war. But the underlying logic was the same, the logic of ensuring that the government could continue to function and that its essential authorities could be exercised even after a catastrophic attack on the capital and its infrastructure. The new investment did not replace the Cold War infrastructure, but was layered on top of it, incorporating it into a broader emergency management architecture that now addressed multiple threat scenarios. The cyber dimension of this expanded threat environment introduced new vulnerabilities and new challenges for the emergency infrastructure. The communication systems that linked the command posts, the early warning systems, and the nuclear forces had been designed in an era when the primary concern was electromagnetic pulse and physical destruction. They had not been designed to be secure against the kinds of sophisticated cyber intrusions that became technically feasible as the digital infrastructure of those systems aged and as the capabilities of potential adversaries in the cyber domain grew. The recognition of this vulnerability led to classified programs to upgrade the cybersecurity of nuclear command and control systems. Programs whose details were not publicly disclosed, but whose existence acknowledged that the Cold War infrastructure, designed for one threat environment, was now operating in a substantially different one. The question of what the Cold War emergency systems were actually designed to protect, and whether the protection they provided served the interests of the population that funded them, was never subjected to serious public deliberation during the period when those systems were being built and operated. It was occasionally raised by critics, congressional investigators, and journalists who caught partial glimpses of the architecture, but it was never given a definitive public answer, because the systems themselves remained classified and because the political culture of the Cold War made questioning the nuclear deterrent posture feel, in many contexts, uncomfortably close to advocating for unilateral disarmament. The answer that the systems themselves embodied, expressed in their design rather than in any public statement, was that the most important thing to protect was the government's ability to function and the nuclear force's ability to launch. The civilian population, whose survival would be the condition of any meaningful governmental function in a post-attack environment, was addressed in the emergency planning through civil defense programs that received dramatically less funding and institutional commitment than the programs designed to protect the command structure. The fallout shelter programs of the early Cold War were eventually allowed to atrophy, and the public information campaigns about nuclear preparedness were abandoned as the government concluded, accurately, that nuclear war with the Soviet Union would be unsurvivable for most of the American population, regardless of what civil defense measures were in place. The emergency systems that continued to be funded and maintained were the ones designed to ensure that the government and the nuclear forces would survive, not the ones designed to ensure that the population would. This prioritization reflected a genuine strategic logic, the logic of deterrence, which required a credible retaliatory capability to function. If the Soviet Union could destroy the American nuclear forces and the command structure in a first strike, the deterrent would fail, and the Soviet Union might rationally conclude that a first strike was worth the risk. Maintaining the survivability of the command structure and the forces was therefore a genuine strategic requirement, not simply an exercise in bureaucratic self-preservation. But the logic of deterrence also required a population to protect, a reason for the deterrent to exist, and the systematic deprioritization of the population's survival in the emergency planning reflected a tension that the architects of the system never fully resolved and never publicly acknowledged. The doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists since 1947 as a symbolic representation of how close the world was to catastrophic nuclear war, stood at various points during the Cold War as close as 2 minutes to midnight, its designer's metaphor for annihilation. The clock's positions over the decades tracked the public perception of nuclear danger based on publicly available information about weapons development, arms control negotiations, and political tensions. But the clock's maintainers did not have access to the classified information that would have given them a complete picture of how close specific incidents had actually come to triggering the systems that the clock was designed to represent. The Petrov incident was not known to them when it occurred. The B-59 submarine incident was not known to them. The full details of Able Archer 83 were not known to them. The clock measured the publicly visible dimensions of the nuclear danger, but the most dangerous moments of the Cold War were precisely the moments that were not publicly visible. The gap between the publicly visible Cold War and the classified Cold War, The gap between the history that could be discussed and the history that existed only in sealed documents was maintained not just by formal classification, but by the institutional culture of silence that surrounded the emergency infrastructure and the incidents associated with it. Personnel who had worked in the command posts, operated the early warning systems, staffed the continuity facilities, and participated in the nuclear planning process understood that their experience was not something they could discuss with spouses, neighbors, friends, or in some cases even colleagues outside their specific compartment. This enforced silence created communities of knowledge that were genuinely separate from the mainstream of American political and cultural life. People who knew things that the society they were serving did not know and could not evaluate. The occasional declassification of Cold War documents, through the mandatory declassification review process, the Freedom of Information Act, and the deliberate declassification programs of specific administrations, has allowed historians to reconstruct portions of this hidden history. The documents released over the decades since the Cold War's end have confirmed, in specific detail, many of the incidents and dynamics that were suspected or partially known, and have revealed others that were entirely unknown. But the declassification process has been uneven, incomplete, and selective. Documents about the most sensitive command and control procedures, about the specific terms of pre-delegated launch authorities, about the precise capabilities of the emergency communication systems, have been declassified rarely, if at all. The most important architecture of the Cold War emergency infrastructure remains, decades after the Cold War's end, substantially protected by the classification system that was built to protect it during the conflict itself. The physical facilities, for their part, have had varied fates. Some, like the Greenbrier bunker, were declassified and eventually opened for public tours. Transformed from secrets into tourist attractions, their classified history became a curiosity for visitors who could walk the same corridors that had been intended to shelter the Congress of the United States. Others, like Mount Weather, continued to operate in their original function, classified and restricted, acknowledged in general terms but not available for public examination. Raven Rock continued to operate as a military command center. The Cheyenne Mountain complex entered standby status, but was maintained in a condition that would allow reactivation. The airborne command post aircraft continued to fly. The submarine communication systems continued to operate. The basic architecture of the Cold War emergency infrastructure, built at enormous expense over decades to manage a specific threat in a specific historical context, remained in place. The nuclear arsenals that the emergency systems were built to command and control had been reduced substantially from their Cold War peaks, but they had not been eliminated. The United States retained thousands of nuclear warheads, many of them on missiles that could be launched within minutes of an order, and Russia retained a comparable arsenal. The command and control systems that linked those warheads to the decision-making authority remained operational. The early warning systems continued to watch for launches. The authentication systems continued to protect the release codes. The procedures that had been developed over 40 years of Cold War experience continued to govern how the forces would be directed. The world that those procedures described, a world in which nuclear war was a genuine operational possibility that needed to be managed with minute-by-minute readiness, had not changed as fundamentally as the political rhetoric of the 1990s had suggested it would. The accidents and near misses of the Cold War period have, in the decades since, been incorporated into a historical narrative that treats them as evidence of the system's ultimate success, proof that the deterrence architecture worked because nuclear war did not occur. This framing is understandable but misleading, because it treats the absence of war as evidence of the system's reliability rather than as a contingent outcome that depended heavily on individual judgments and fortunate circumstances that the system itself had not been designed to produce. Stanislav Petrov made a decision that prevented an escalation, but the system had not been designed to produce his decision. Vasily Arkhipov made a decision that prevented a launch from the B-59, but the system had not been designed to produce his decision either. The system had been designed to produce reliable, authenticated, timely responses to verified threats. And in the incidents that came closest to catastrophe, what prevented catastrophe was precisely the willingness of individuals to depart from the system's designed logic. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the lowering of the Soviet flag over the Kremlin, and the emergence of 15 successor states from the ruins of the largest country on Earth. It ended without a nuclear exchange. It ended without the emergency systems being activated for the purpose they had been designed to serve. The hardened facilities in the mountains of Virginia and Pennsylvania and Colorado were never used to shelter the survivors of a nuclear attack. The airborne command aircraft never transmitted launch orders through a burning sky. The submarine crews never received authenticated emergency action messages ordering them to engage their targets. The systems that had been built at incalculable expense and with extraordinary institutional effort to manage the end of the world remained in readiness for an event that did not occur. But the systems did not end with the Cold War. They continued. The institutional knowledge required to operate them was maintained. The personnel who staffed them continued to rotate through their assignments. The classified appropriations that funded them continued to flow. The procedures that governed their operation continued to be practiced and refined. The logic that had produced them, the logic that said that the most dangerous scenario was one in which the capability to respond did not survive the attack, remained the organizing principle of nuclear strategy in the decades that followed. The Cold War concluded. The systems that had sustained it, that had given it its particular character of permanent readiness and managed catastrophe, did not.